Lots of people are still joining. Hi to everyone who's just joined. We're just going to let everyone filter in for another moment or so. If you want to say hello in the chat, or we're asking people to let us know what their favourite season is this morning, to just get to know people a little bit better, then that would be great. We've got 2 votes for spring so far. For golf, yeah, dry weather is what we're waiting for, isn't it? That's what I'm excited for as well, for sure. Summer if we ever get it, exactly. It's hit or miss here, isn't it? Yeah, we can all live in hope. Yeah, not seasoning, season. I think my favourite seasoning would have to be basil, though. That's what I'd pick. Makes me think of summer, which I would choose as a season as well. Okay, perfect. We're still filtering in a little bit, but I think we're going to kick it off. So from talking about weather and rain, a really smooth segue, we're going to go straight into talking about the umbrella consultation. Today's webinar will cover the potential impact of the consultation on the umbrella and recruitment market. This webinar is brought to you by the Giant Group, a leading contingent workforce management company for over 30 years. Just to introduce myself briefly, I'm Betty Underwood. I'm the Events Marketing Coordinator here at Giant Group. I'll be your host today as we learn more about the umbrella consultation. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll focus on the potential impact of the umbrella consultation, exploring what proposals the government has made and sharing our views on the likely outcomes and how businesses can prepare for these changes. We expect there to be lots of questions, so please send them via the Q&A button, and we'll leave 20 minutes or so at the end to address as many as we possibly can. The areas that we'll cover include the background and why HMRC are in consultation, an overview of the consultation and the proposed options, tax and maintenance day update from the 18th of April, what the potential risks are for agencies, how the market might react to the changes, potential solutions, and then we'll follow up with that Q&A. So just to introduce our keynote speakers today, we've got Michael Howard, Head of Agency Sales here at Giant Group. Michael has worked in the industry for 14 years, helping agencies navigate through a variety of legislation changes to ensure compliance and maintain profitability. Michael heads up our agency sales team to ensure our recruitment partners have access to the full range of Giant Group services. And then we also have Christopher Walsh, who is our National Sales Manager. His role includes managing the business development / SME account management team and supporting their clients to manage their contingent workforce compliantly and cost effectively, using the whole range of Giant services and products. Chris has worked in the sector for over 7 years across several of the largest payroll companies in the sector. The format of this session will be for Michael and Chris to address several set questions which I'll put to them in order to give us a full view from an agency perspective. Please don't hesitate to submit your questions throughout. Let's begin then with a look at the current state of the market and why the government has held this consultation. Chris, good afternoon. We'll come to you first. Firstly, what is the problem that HMRC are looking to address with this consultation?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Betty, and great to see so many people joining the webinar today. I think, streamline, the government is seeking views still on proposals to tackle non-compliance with both tax and employment rights by umbrella companies. In the UK, there are about circa 600 umbrella companies at present, all with varying degrees of compliance in a sector which still remains unregulated. And of course, the government, as we know, has been slow to enforce this. The main reason appears to have been the difficulty on defining an umbrella company, and HMRC have asked for suggestions from the market in order to do so. And the government has 3 main objectives with the consultation. These are to deliver improved outcomes for workers i.e. employment rights, correct taxes and deductions being taken, holiday pay and tax being taken in accordance with tax laws. They are looking to support a level playing field within the umbrella company market, and they're also looking to protect taxpayers from the significant revenue losses that currently arise from non-compliance. To tackle tax non-compliance in the contingent labour market, the government initially proposed 3 options. Option 1 is the introduction of mandatory due diligence requirement, with penalties applying to those employment businesses or end clients that do not comply. Option 2 was to legislate to give HMRC the company tax debt from another business within the supply chain. And the third option on the table was to deem the employment businesses that supply the worker to the end client to be the employer for tax purposes. This last option would require a party further up the supply chain to operate PAYE on payments to contingent workers. The final part requested was views specifically on how to reduce fraud relating to the employment allowance and VAT flat rate scheme, which are both targeted by fraudulent umbrella companies. It also sets out a proposal to mandate that a UK director be in place for a company to be eligible for the employment allowance.
Thanks, Chris. Michael, if I can bring you in at this point, can you tell us how big of an issue is non-compliant umbrella activity within this market?
Yeah, thanks, Betty. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I suppose non-compliance, unfortunately, has been tarnished within the umbrella marketplace for as long as I've been involved in the umbrella world, at least the last 10, 15 years, which is ultimately, Betty, why one of the reasons HMRC have consulted around this topic. Non-compliance can be and has been deemed in a number of ways within our industry. Potentially, when I joined the industry over a decade ago, contractors were being paid in a way that they wanted to be paid rather than being directed or guided by recruitment agencies. The term sort of 90% take-home pay was brandished about across a number of companies towards the early 2000s, 2010s, and unfortunately still to this day there are still a number of advertised businesses that are able to pay contractors in this way. Ultimately, workers were getting paid in the form of a loan, which didn't involve any PAYE tax or national insurance being paid to the Treasury. Other examples of non-compliance in the sector can be where workers have been previously paid via an MSCP. We understand the MSC changes back in 2007, but still, even to this day, there are companies that unfortunately pay workers in the form of dividends without the relevant tax and national insurance being declared from that assignment income. Other recent examples, and I think there's just been a mention in the chat on today's webinar, is regarding mini umbrellas. This involves saving of national insurance and VAT, whereby multiple smaller organisations are involved within a larger group. And again, this is not in the spirit nor of the legislation of what an umbrella company should be declaring. It does vary the level of non-compliance based on the sector that companies are engaged with. Education, medical sectors, where there is a much higher volume of contingent workers, there are much more common non-compliant organisations involved. I think if you move more towards white collar sectors, there is still certain levels of non-compliance, but maybe not as rife. Contractors in certain sectors seem still to be taking the lead on how they are to be paid, rather than being guided and supported by businesses like recruitment agencies on this webinar today, where there may not be a relevant due diligence being carried out, there may not be relevant audits being carried out, and I think agencies over the last 10, 15 years have been supportive to try and ensure that the level of compliance improves throughout the supply chain, albeit there is still a level of non-compliance in certain sectors. HMRC have picked up on the Treasury not being able to gather PAYE tax and national insurance as much as they should. And to start with this, they brought in, we spoke about MSC in 2007. They then moved on to tackling non-compliance in 2014 when they brought in the onshore offshore legislation. This pretty much overnight prompted the need for recruitment agencies, and a number of them I've dealt with that are on the webinar today, involving a preferred supplier list. I think prior to this legislation change, businesses were very much hands-off and didn't want to get involved in choices or arrangements for contractors to be paid. But due to the government trying to tackle this non-compliance, onshore-offshore legislation made that dial turn massively, and I think the majority of the businesses that are on this webinar today will have or have adopted a preferred supplier list of some sort. HMRC then moved the dial towards travel and subsistence changes a couple of years later, and were the benefit of a contractor previous was to get tax relief on travelling to and from work. They brought in the requirement where the contractor was only able to do this if they were not under supervision, direction and control, which again resulted in quite a lot of challenges and quite a lot of workers not being able to claim the tax relief that they were previously eligible to receive. I think just recently, I think the Criminal Finance Act a couple of years later was brought in to ensure that companies take reasonable care wherever you are and wherever you sit in the supply chain, to ensure that non-compliance is not anywhere to do with the supply chain that you're engaged with. And ultimately, the government are making steps to try and target this non-compliance. And you know, this umbrella consultation is definitely the next step in the government's reading in this space.
Amazing, thanks Michael. A quick reminder to everyone at this point, please continue to submit any questions you have using the Q&A option. And then Chris, how could you explain the consultation process and how that works, and also what are the timeframes involved?
Yeah, so as I mentioned initially, HMRC outlined 3 areas that they suggested changes could be made. Unfortunately, at this point, we still don't really have any tangible information on exactly what the umbrella market regulation will look like. Again, even following last Thursday's update from the government in the Tax Administration and Maintenance Day announcement. But we expect this to be included in the plan guidance, as they've mentioned, further into 2024. What we can say from the information that we received last week was that they're looking at option 1 out of the 3, which is that mandating of due diligence piece as an answer to regulation over the other 2 options which were on the table. Again, that's debt chain transfer and the EB employment business being responsible for the PAYE deductions. We obviously welcome this latest update as a vital step in moving towards regulation in the marketplace. And again, from our view, this was not to be taken just as a simple administrative update. It's definitely being viewed as a next step towards the wide-ranging overhaul of the sector. I think many contractors, agencies and hirers view this overhaul as vital to restoring the trust in the contingent labour market in the UK. We need to ensure that the sector is compliant with regulations and there are, of course, adequate deterrents to stop bad actors from exploiting the supply chain further. The update that we received last week also included reference, I think you'll have seen this most on the call, to an online pay checking tool to ultimately help umbrella company workers check that the correct deductions are being made from the pay. Now, on this point, we all know the issues related to the reliability of the CES tool, which was, of course, introduced to support with SDS determinations when off payroll was first introduced back in 2017. So it remains to be seen how useful or accurate this pay checking tool will be once launched. But of course, we'll await further updates in 2024 with regards to this, and also the actual requirements that are going to be put onto ultimately the party that contracts with the umbrella company in relation to the due diligence for employment businesses for their onward supply chain. We'll, of course, look to provide further guidance and information on this as and when the government release further information to the market. What we did see as a really sort of swift turnaround was HMRC provided an update just yesterday entitled Warning for Employment Agencies Using Umbrella Companies under Spotlight 64. It stated that they are aware of uncompliant umbrella companies who actively use recruitment agencies to promote their tax avoidance schemes. Typically, these umbrella companies will give commitments about their schemes to agencies that are too good to be true, and we know that they often are. So whilst employment and recruitment agencies might believe they're agreeing to one set of arrangements, it could be a tax avoidance scheme that the umbrella is truly promoting. These schemes are targeted at contingent workers who may not know the risks of using such schemes. HMRC have advised that employment and recruitment agencies should be, number one, checking carefully the details that they're given by the umbrella companies about their products, and number two, consider taking independent professional advice if they are unsure if an umbrella company they plan to use is compliant. Most of these schemes do not work and are successfully challenged by HMRC in the courts and tribunals, and agencies are being told that they need to avoid recommending such schemes. HMRC have also explicitly stated that agencies must also carry out due diligence to make sure at present they are not using non-compliant umbrella companies. They've come up with a signs an umbrella company may be operating a tax avoidance scheme, and it's as follows. So A, umbrella companies who offer financial incentives which are significantly higher than industry standards. B, they provide contractors and agencies with different versions of their payslip. C, they make payments to workers that are higher than the amount on their payslip. D, they make payments to third parties who then make onward payments to the workers directly. And as has been raised in the chat already today, they're based outside of the UK. They've also stated that those 5 points there are not an exhaustive list. They then follow this up with the fact that they're actually now directly listing what the potential risks are for recruitment agencies. And the main one that they've focused on at present is reputational. So your reputation, for everybody on the call today, is at risk, of course, if you are taking part in non-compliant supply chains. And these include supply chains involving umbrella companies who are operating tax avoidance schemes. Taking part in these supply chains could, in HMRC's words, number one, damage the reputation of your business. Two, affect your ability to secure and maintain contracts. And number three, affect your business relationships with workers and end clients. The key fourth point that they focused on here now is directly related to financial risk outside of that reputational piece. They've stated that you could face financial damage due to the penalties and tax liabilities. HMRC have explicitly stated that they will directly pursue anybody who promotes or enables tax avoidance. If HMRC defeats an abusive tax avoidance arrangement, they will use the enablers penalty regime against anybody who, number one, designed the arrangement, number two, sold the arrangement, number three, importantly, enabled the use of the arrangement. Under the new powers that they introduced back in 2022, HMRC are able to publish information about enablers when they suspect that they are involved in either A, promoting a tax avoidance scheme, or B, having a role in making a scheme available to use. The government recently, as we know, and we're talking about here today, consulted on options in it to allow them to tackle non-compliance in the market. And these included penalties for agencies who fail to carry out mandatory due diligence, and B, additional circumstances in which agencies could be liable to pay tax liabilities. Responses to the consultation will be published in due course again, and HMRC have announced that this, well, we should hear further in 2024. The current guidance related to steps to take to protect your agency include finding out how to reduce your risk of using an umbrella company who operates a tax avoidance scheme, regularly checking the HMRC list of named tax avoidance schemes, promoters, enablers and suppliers, often referred to as the broad range HMRC's blacklist, being aware of the responsibilities for employment businesses working with umbrella companies as well. So from a worker's standpoint, HMRC point to their tax avoidance don't get caught out campaign. This allows workers to spot the warning signs of tax avoidance, report tax avoidance when they see it, leave or report a tax avoidance scheme if they're already involved. And it also gives them additional guidance on working through an umbrella company, which helps them to understand how they'll be paid.
Amazing. Thanks for that, Chris. Michael, could you please give us an overview of the potential risks there are for agencies?
Yeah, thanks, Betty. I think obviously Chris has covered off quite a number of points from HMRC's view in terms of the detail within the consultation. I think where I'll cover off, Betty, is the sort of angles that these changes could have a sort of domino effect within the supply chain. So I think there'll be a reduced number of umbrella companies that will be engaged within the marketplace. I think we have several hundred umbrella companies, 400, 500, 600 umbrella companies actively payrolling contingent workers. I think should HMRC get what they want to achieve, which is reduce and remove the non-compliance, we will see a reduced number of umbrella companies being engaged with, and ultimately those that will be left will be the ones that will be doing everything correctly, compliantly, and working towards the end goal, which is making our industry as compliant as possible. I think the risks that agencies that are on this call today have got to be aware of is if they're currently engaging with a company that maybe, shall we say, creative, maybe, shall we say, a little bit less vanilla than others, it may well have impact on you as a business, not only on the policies and the direct information from Chris's notes, but also you may benefit from using that current umbrella company with the likes of payment terms. You may be outsourcing that debt to an umbrella company, and should that company then not be able to sort of meet the compliance regulations, then you as a business may well face, inherit debt by not engaging with that company going forward. There is the option ultimately to move that debt across the board to other umbrella companies, but I think it's important to realise, like Chris mentioned on some of his points earlier, if there's anything over and above exceptionally higher than what is standard practice, that may not be able to be offset to other compliant businesses when they are removed or not trading anymore. There's a lot of businesses on this call that ultimately leverage commercial benefits with umbrella companies. Again, if some of these companies are no longer trading or no longer able to provide services to you as a business, there's going to be a hole in your business revenue. So ultimately, what you're getting from a certain company now, you may not be able to replicate that certain level of commercial revenue from a compliant business. So it's important that we think about the domino effect that this could have on the industry, which I think is a positive, is that we're going to reduce the number of umbrella companies that are engaged, and it's going to be left with the ones that are doing things correctly and compliantly. I think for those agencies on the webinar today and those that have registered for this, you'll get the notes afterwards. I think it's about ensuring that you're consolidating your supply chain. So for those businesses that are much more financially stable, are they able to ensure that you're governing your own compliance within your supply chain? So I think there'll be a lot of businesses that look at what the financial stability is of the onward supplier down the chain will be, and not just do they have a certain accreditation or do they not tick certain boxes on an RFI tender. What do the financial stability look like of onward suppliers? As Chris has mentioned, and obviously coming directly from HMRC's notes last week, there's a huge increased risk of fines for non-compliant providers, and that will likely be passed up the supply chain. We look at people who are on this webinar today, majority of the time, a lot of businesses now have preferred supplier lists for a reason, but there is still a percentage of workers that are engaged outside of that PSL. And, if you're a legal director or if you're in compliance, the question's got to be asked, well, if we've got a preferred supplier list, then we really should be sticking to that as much as we possibly can. And, the exceptions are a very, very minor exception, rather than we've got a preferred supplier list, but we like contractors use if we've worked with that company before. The risk has massively increased by this spotlight on the umbrella consultation, and we've got to see this as a positive, that our industry is going to be a lot more compliant than it has been over a number of years.
Amazing, thanks, Michael. Chris, from your recent conversations with agencies, how do you think they might react to the proposed changes highlighted last week?
Yeah, thanks, Betty. I think there's a top line. There's a number of points which are being considered at the minute by agencies. What is this mandatory due diligence ultimately going to look like? So I think from a business standpoint, are there potentially going to be any increased costs with regards to actually being able to meet the demands that HMRC set out? Firstly, does that then come with additional resource for compliance departments, in terms of building this out to make sure that these demands are being met? We've already discussed, myself and Michael, from different angles, what the potential risks are, mainly reputationally or financially. And also, is the ability to outsource processes with regards to due diligence requirements going out to third parties as well. So that's the top line. I think into the detail, I think as set out in the call for evidence, HMRC are aware of several types of non-compliance. We've mentioned a couple today that are prevalent within the market, including fraud, disguised remuneration, tax avoidance arrangements. They've already been taking some action in attempting to police the market and making progress in tackling non-compliance. Again, back to that HMRC blacklist as a broad spectrum overview, but it's all too reactive and not preventative really at present. The government's concerned with delivering a more strategic approach to address all non-compliant behaviour, which is facilitated by umbrella companies. Responses to the call for evidence suggest that the current operations of the temporary labour market encourages end clients and employment businesses ultimately to outsource many of their obligations to umbrella companies. Whilst outsourcing is a legitimate business model and can create administrative and cost efficiencies for businesses, it also can create risks they've specifically mentioned yesterday, again back to that reputation and financial piece. These risks are significant within this market, where companies can be responsible for processing millions and in some cases billions of pounds of payments for workers and ensuring that the correct taxes and NICs are passed to HMRC. These risks, of course, can lead to harm for workers who may not receive the correct national insurance credits, with potential consequences for state pension entitlements. The ease with which umbrella companies can be established and subsequently liquidated also poses significant challenges for HMRC to ultimately take effective enforcement action where non-compliance is identified. Again, back to the responses to the call of evidence, this also suggests that those businesses that do not take steps to ensure good compliance are put ultimately at a competitive disadvantage to those that do not, allowing non-compliant entities to undercut the compliant firms who are in place. This is not fair ultimately on legitimate businesses, and it in turn puts pressure on those that are compliant, cutting corners to compete, ultimately driving down standards across the entire market. So again, back to a focus on the main option here, which is that mandatory due diligence. In our view, this was not only the most likely option, but also potentially the least disruptive of the three options available, which is the good news. Currently, recruitment agencies and hirers, Michael's mentioned this, usually have their own due diligence processes when bringing in either A, a new umbrella partner onto their PSL, or B, going through those typically annual PSL renewals. The government's view is that employment businesses who supply workers to end clients undertake some form of due diligence on the umbrella companies that they contract with to ensure that those companies are genuine, comply with their obligations, and ultimately treat the workers properly. However, it's currently not universal across the market, with some businesses having no or only limited procedures in place. Typically, what we see, the compliance questionnaires, are based on either the APSCO or REP frameworks, and they tend to only look at the surface level compliance of an umbrella company. What we do see is that from your enterprise level employment businesses, they tend to have additional compliance protocols that we need to go through. And they also require everybody within that onward supply chain to be subjected to during the PSL vetting process. Responses also suggest that entities further up the supply chain, such as end clients, often don't have a full view of the entities that make up their labour supply chains. The government believes that this creates a lack of visibility and absence of due diligence, and that's where the gaps in non-compliant umbrellas tend to enter and operate within the labour supply chain. Looking forwards, in the last documented and really detailed update, which came out last year in June 23, that's the Tackling Non-Compliance in the Umbrella Company Market consultation document, the 58-page that's still up on their website. They're looking to build, as they state in here, on good practices that already exist amongst many employment businesses and end hirers. Government's interested in exploring a requirement for organisations contracting with umbrella companies to carry out a minimum level of due diligence on said onward supply chain. They've also said that they're interested in exploring if a requirement for businesses using umbrella companies to carry out mandatory due diligence with a potential penalty for failure to do so, may lead to fewer non-compliant umbrella companies entering into labour supply chains. Of course, again, protecting workers from harms that can arise. So in terms of general operation, how they're looking at this is that the obligation, again, would sit with either the end client or employment business that's in the contractual relationship and supplies the worker to the end client. It's the government's view that obviously a mandatory due diligence requirement should require businesses to seek to secure the labour supply chains against all forms of tax non-compliance. And these include error, avoidance and fraud. The government has also previously considered requiring businesses to conduct due diligence into whether individuals working via their own personal service companies were complying with the intermediaries legislation, IR35. They ultimately rejected this idea in favour of the extension of the off-payroll working reform back in April 21. The proposal in the consultation is for a broader due diligence requirement covering the conduct of a type of employment intermediary which operates in a substantially different way, supplying many workers at once rather than the single worker typically supplied by a personal service company. They have stated that they recognise the need for businesses to have certainty around any due diligence requirements, but yet we still await guidance on exactly what these requirements will entail. And given the range of checks that can fall within the definition of due diligence and that different checks may be more or less relevant in certain scenarios, the government considers that it may be preferable that any legislative requirements is not prescriptive as to the precise checks which should be undertaken, though this is still under review at this point. Instead, what they could look to do is support businesses to understand what is expected of them and how to comply with the requirements through guidance. For example, HMRC has already published guidance on due diligence principles when sourcing labour, which sets out the steps customers can take to ensure the integrity of their labour supply chains. Now, looking at the penalty regime, there's very little that's been stated around this. However, what they have said, again, relates back to June's 2023 written guidance. So, in terms of businesses in scope of the requirement, they would definitely be subject to a penalty if they fail to undertake the required due diligence. And it could be one of two different things: set at A, a fixed amount, or B, be linked directly to the amount of any tax that has not been paid by a non-compliant umbrella company in that business's labour supply chain. And in terms of our view, I think that B is going to be the more likely option if we think about IR35 and how they police that. It's linked to the individual and tax which hasn't been paid as a result of them working through their PSC if found to be inside. So again, they're still reviewing views from all stakeholders on the scale of the penalty for failure to comply. What they're ultimately looking to do is to enforce something that is as much as a deterrent as is possible so that they can get the desired change in business behaviour. The stated intention of the penalty regime ultimately is to incentivise and hires agencies to ensure the legitimacy of any umbrella companies that they choose to utilise the services of. They also recognise that in some instances, despite the best endeavours of end clients and employment businesses, tax non-compliance may still occur within labour supply chains, as well as views on the appropriate level of penalty to deliver on the intentions of the requirement. The government states that they will be interested to hear around what safeguards stakeholders think should be part of a mandatory due diligence regime. Finally, onto the impact. So the possibility that some businesses actually might look to engage temporary labour outside of the umbrella company model, rather than engage with requirements to undertake due diligence. They're acutely aware of this. They're also interested in what respondents think the impacts of a mandatory due diligence requirement are likely to be on labour supply chains and related businesses. They also want respondents' views on the impact that the due diligence requirement could have for workers engaged via umbrella companies. And really, they've set out a few key areas stated that have consistently been reported to them as the main areas of detriment for umbrella employees. The initial areas of focus which they're looking at should include the handling of pay and holiday pay, So the government could require umbrella companies to pay the individuals they employ all the money they are owed for all the hours they've worked. Obligations should apply, however the umbrella company structures its contracts, and should require the umbrella company to pay the individual even if they've not been paid by the employment business. This mirrors the obligation on employment businesses to pay work seekers irrespective of payment by the hirer, and it also seeks to create a chain of obligations that flows from the employment business down to the individual. They could look at the use of additional services, so they could seek to prevent umbrella companies making entry into an employment contract conditional upon the individual agreeing to pay for additional services offered by the umbrella company beyond their margin. The government really could require greater transparency about the margin up front. And again, that relates back to the key information document. So the government could place a positive duty on umbrella companies to pass on accurate information to the employment businesses that they contract with, and make it a need to provide the key information document. It remained a responsibility, however, of the employment business to issue said KID to the worker. Again, brief overview on the other two options, quite a detailed view at that due diligence piece. But ultimately, option 2 would have been debt chain transfer. Well, how would that have impacted the market? Really, it could have been very disruptive. If we look at how hirers reacted to IR35, would they ban umbrella companies? If that were to be the case and they went with that option 2, workers ultimately wouldn't have been too happy with just standard PAYE offerings. The final one would have been the employment business being responsible for deducting, statutory deductions for PAYE. That would have led to a big increase in demand for agencies to provide PAYE services directly. We at Giant could still have a role to play here with regards to our own PAYE service that we would have had on call with regards to this option if it had come to the fore. But again, not to go too much into the other two options detail, as we feel, ultimately that it's going to be this due diligence requirement that's going to be the option that they go down.
Amazing. Thanks, Chris. That's a really nice segue into our final question concerning the potential solutions that are available. Michael, could you run through these options, please?
Yeah, thanks, Betty. I think options for agencies are not too dissimilar to where they are now. I think it's all about ensuring that there's tight controls within that supply chain. So I mentioned on the previous points, businesses have generally got preferred supplier lists. Will we see a reduction in that preferred supplier list to ensure there's a much tighter control in that supply chain? Probably. Will we see that off PSL number reduce or get removed? I think businesses on the whole have got exceptions and a number of workers that are off PSL because for ease and for less challenge from the contractor. But actually, given everything that we've spoke about on today's webinar, given the increased spotlight in non-compliance and greater control required, I think businesses, owners, directors, compliance members that are on the webinar today should be really thinking about the business that we've got on this supply chain. Are they going to ensure that they meet the demands of HMRC? Are they financially secure if anything was to go wrong? Do they meet all of the due diligence and requirements that we ask of them? And ultimately, it's you guys as a business owners, to manage the supply chain to ensure that them controls are met from start to finish. What we may see, and Chris maybe touched on that point just before he finished his topic, was you may see clients knee-jerk. We saw this previously in I-35, both in 2017, 2020 and 2021 before it got delayed 12 months. And clients, unfortunately, are very, very less educated than probably most of the people on this webinar today. They pass the risk and they pass the knowledge to you and I. And the easiest option for clients is to knee-jerk against any legislative change. They ban the use in a lot of cases of limited companies for I-35. And like Chris mentioned, clients, what we don't want them to do is knee-jerk around banning the need of umbrella companies. Clearly, I don't think that will happen in the main, but you may well get certain clients that misunderstand, misrepresent certain things, and they just want to stay as far away from the spotlight and the risk as possible. Many of the businesses I've met with over the last 6 to 12 months talking about this topic, they generally don't want and don't have the technology, resource and expertise of running a high-level PAYE book. I don't think there's any benefit for workers, or very limited, and ultimately agencies want to focus on search and selection and client engagement rather than processing payroll. Ultimately, that's why you use umbrella companies. I think solutions to mention, and ultimately for those that don't know, Giant have been providing outsourced PAYE, PEO options for businesses for the last 10 to 15 years. We can leverage some of the benefits that your contractors currently receive in the umbrella world. So I think since all of the TNS changes have been brought in, I think a lot of the I-35 changes have been brought in. Some of the benefits that you leverage on umbrella companies is the benefit for payment terms. It's become quite topical over the last 12, 18 months with interest rates. Giant's outsourced PAY offering, again, can maintain that level of payment terms. So in terms of commercial impact and domino effect, Giant are in a positive position to be able to support. In terms of benefits and solutions for contractors, should this sort of be enforced upon you, contractors who are quite savvy, white collar and experienced, they may well have their own self-invested private pension set up through an umbrella company, and that reduces the level of tax in a compliant manner via salary sacrifice. For those businesses that do offer a PAYE service in-house, you would typically offer them an auto-enrolment or a standard pension arrangement. Giant's outsourced PAYE PEO offering also maintains the option of a self-invested private pension. So it also helps retain and attract talent and not be impacted too much regarding rates. So should you have clients that knee-jerk, should you have clients that enforce the ban of certain solutions, we as a business are in a fortunate position that we can pivot and align to what your client demands. Another question and solution, Betty, I think touched on this point a few times over this webinar, is when you as a business, and whether it be a business owner, compliance or legal, some of the elements that you outsource are to benefit you commercially as a business. We see a lot now in terms of businesses outsourcing not only the umbrella employment risk, but also outsourcing credit terms and payment terms. That's seen a huge increase over the last 12, 18 months, mainly down to the rise in interest rates. It'd be interesting to know, and this is an open question, maybe we can have a bit of session on this later on in the webinar, but for those that ask for payment terms as a requirement for entry into the preferred supplier list of your companies, do you also add an additional layer of protection where is that debt insured? And for those that don't ask that question, and as we move into the spotlight of compliance and making sure that our supply chain is as compliant as possible, a business that's able to offer and say yes that they can provide payment terms, but not give you the assurance that that debt is insured, could potentially provide additional layers of risk for you as a business. So just as an acknowledgement to everybody on the webinar, Giant do provide payment terms, and it's commercially arranged with a lot of businesses that we support. We do ensure that any commercial business relationships we have where credit and payment terms are provided, that debt is insured, to ensure that, again, we protect that supply chain upwards towards the agency, the MSP and the client, and obviously downwards towards the contractor. So I suppose in terms of solutions, it's not too different to what a lot of businesses are doing at the moment, but I think it's just another layer from HMRC's perspective to try and ensure that the minority of non-compliant organisations that are still around now are hugely reduced, hopefully removed, and the sooner we can all move forward working on a level playing field, and not sort of compete with companies that, let's say, do things a little bit creatively compared to what they should be.
Thanks so much for that. Thank you both for some real insight over the last half an hour or so into something that we obviously all need to embrace and have a good understanding of moving forwards. We've got lots of questions in the Q&A chat, so I'm going to spend some time asking you those questions for the audience. What I'm beginning to see is lots of questions, firstly on, like, can employers still use umbrella companies? Is that a recommendation? And then, so if the answer is yes, how do we judge the compliance? Because is it that if they're FCSA accredited, then that's the green light and that's the go ahead? Or if not, what criteria can employers be following so that they're making a good choice?
Happy to take that one, Betty, and thanks for the question. I think from an agency perspective, there's a lot of supply accreditations out there. I'm not going to name them all, but we all know the companies that are providing umbrella services. You've probably got to ensure that you do your own due diligence. You do your own set of audits. So you have a look at the financial stability of that company you're engaging with, which is important. Have you worked with that company before? Have they got a long-standing reputational business within the industry? What's the size of the business that you're looking to engage with? And not only when you start having an engagement with that business, but what is your ongoing policies? What do you do every month? What do you do every quarter? What do you do every year? Auditing pay slips is important because it gets you to be visible on what the contractor has been paid, what level of deductions are being made, and also what the worker should be paid. So you all get a KID document, or you should be getting KID documents from the outset. You can translate that into the pay slips that the actual worker gets, and you can request RTI information from the umbrella company. I think there isn't a silver bullet here in me telling you that you use one accreditation, you're effectively job's done and you get a tick in the box. Every accreditation have got their own merits, and every accreditation has got their own positive outlook on things. For me, there's a benefit in outsourcing work to umbrella companies, and there's a benefit in listening to the gold standard professional bodies that are in the marketplace. But ultimately, as a director, as an owner, as a compliance leader, you've got to take your own responsibilities to make sure that you're managing that supply chain onwards for your contractors, but also for your relationship with your MSP and your clients.
Amazing, thank you so much. Then a few people wanted the question answering, have the HMRC considered accrediting or giving umbrellas their own stamp of approval, so to speak, as that feels like the easiest way for them to potentially monitor this level of compliance?
I'm happy to take that one, Betty. I think when I mentioned earlier on, way earlier on in the webinar around, the guidance with Spotlight 64 that came out yesterday, you will see a number of umbrella companies, and probably a lot of you have seen emails or maybe had calls from a business development standpoint from umbrella companies who will pitch in that they are HMRC approved. We've seen it over the years, myself and Michael, a number of times. No umbrella company is HMRC approved, but a lot of these, as you say, Michael, the sort of companies that are paying contractors through hugely creative ways will state this when they're trying to pitch for a spot on a supply chain with a recruitment business or end hirer. At the minute, in my view, again, HMRC are very hands-off with regards to approving any umbrella companies. They don't want to have any direct relationship to state, yes, this company or these set of companies are doing things as they should be, because, ultimately from HMRC's standpoint is that if they can reclaim any tax or unpaid liabilities out there within the marketplace, they will, and they'll go after entities to do so. They want to be really hands-off as things stand with regards to stating this is a regulated practice. Within the financial services sector, we have the FCA that ultimately control and mandate financial services companies. It's a regulated marketplace. From a legal standpoint, you've got the SRA, Solicitors Regulatory Authority, again, that regulate that marketplace. I think until we get some further guidance, towards maybe the back end of this year with regards to this mandatory due diligence and what that looks like, I don't think that we're going to have HMRC, really going towards this marketplace and saying they are approved or this set are approved. It's going to be down to a regulatory body who are going to ultimately police and mandate the sector moving forward. So I think, yes, I agree with you. The easiest thing for them to do would be to do this, but they're not going to do that. If we look at HMRC with regards to payroll, again, different type of legislation here that we're looking at, but they created the CES tool, but then they went after a number of their own public sector bodies regards to using the CES tool to do their SDS determinations and lobbied fines at them. So, I think that HMRC are going to be very hands-off with approving or stating that this number of entities you should be working with. I think they'll go regulate the marketplace and then allow a third party to ultimately control and police the sector at that point.
Amazing, thank you so much. I've got another question here that is passport approved umbrellas, can we trust them enough to use them?
I think it goes back to my similar point, is you can trust accredited bodies as much as you want to put the trust in a third party. You can obviously review the policies and review the processes, but ultimately, if by following third party processes leads you with non-compliance, then you as the employment business will be liable for any debt transfer, like Chris mentioned in his earlier points. So for me, there's a lot of benefit and trust with a lot of people that are doing a lot of good things in the industry. But ultimately, as a business owner, to ensure compliance, you've got to take your own view, your own responsibilities to ensure that what people say they do, they actually follow through with.
Amazing, thank you. I think that's all the questions we probably have time for today. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from these questions shows that actually a lot of these things are open to interpretation and also just need to be done with due diligence moving forwards. And that's one of the reasons today why you can contact us going forwards. And there's a level of expertise here that we encourage you to use going forwards. We'll be following up tomorrow with an email with the recording and contact details so that you can use those as well. If there are any specific questions, like I said, get in touch with Chris or with Michael. We can address those offline. Thank you again to our guest speakers, Michael and Chris. And if you need help with planning for these potential changes and to discuss the options available, don't hesitate to get in touch. But we thank you so much for your time today. And that's bye from us, I think.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks all. Appreciate your time.